The blood-red seal on the parchment was still warm when Alara's father pressed her trembling hand against it, binding her fate with a single crimson fingerprint that would cost her everything she'd ever known and deliver her into the hands of death itself. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. "It's done," her father whispered, his weathered hands shaking as he rolled the contract and handed it to the cloaked figure standing in their doorway. The stranger's pale fingers emerged from the shadows, accepting the document with an elegance that seemed to mock the squalor of their tiny cottage. Elara stared at the bag of grain that now sat where her childhood had been moments before. The golden kernel spilled slightly from the coarse burlap, each one representing a day of survival her family had purchased with her freedom. Her mother sobbed quietly in the corner, her face buried in her hands, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. "The girl comes with me now," the stranger said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. When he stepped closer to the flickering candlelight, Elara caught her first glimpse of his face. Sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, skin pale as moonlight, and eyes that held the depth of centuries. "Please," her mother finally spoke, lifting her tear-stained face. "She's only 17. Can't you wait until—" "The contract is sealed." His words fell like stones into still water. "And I am not known for my patience with those who attempt to renegotiate after terms have been agreed upon." Ilara's younger brother, Thomas, clung to her skirts. At 8 years old, he understood enough to know that his sister was leaving and might never return. She knelt beside him, memorizing the freckles across his nose, the gap between his front teeth, the way his dark hair fell across her forehead. "Be brave for Mama and Papa," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "And remember that I love you." The stranger, she still didn't know his name, waited with supernatural stillness while she gathered her few possessions, a worn dress, her mother's wooden comb, and a small book of prayers that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything else that mattered couldn't be packed. As they stepped into the night, Elara turned back once to see her family framed in the golden rectangle of their doorway. Her father's shoulders were bent with shame, her mother's sobs echoed in the darkness, and Thomas pressed his small face against the window. The image seared itself into her memory like a brand. "Your carriage awaits," the stranger said, gesturing toward an ornate black coach that definitely hadn't been there when he'd first knocked on their door. The horses, if they could be called horses, seemed to be made of shadow and starlight, their eyes glowing with an inner fire that matched nothing in the natural world. "What are you?" Elara asked as he handed her up into the carriage. The interior was lined with midnight blue velvet, and silver fixtures caught the moonlight streaming through the windows. "I am many things," he replied, settling across from her with fluid grace. "But you may call me Lord Kieran Ashworth, and I am the reason your family will survive the coming winter." The carriage lurched into motion, but there was no sound of hooves on the dirt road, no creaking of wheels or jingling of harness. They seemed to glide through the darkness as if the night itself carried them forward. "Where are you taking me?" Elara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the cold she felt had nothing to do with the temperature. "To Raven's Hollow Castle," Kieran replied, his pale hands folded in his lap. "Your new home. And what am I to do there? Cook? Clean? Serve at table?" She tried to keep her voice steady, though fear made it tremble at the edges. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, revealing teeth that seemed just slightly too sharp. "Oh, my dear girl, you're going to save my kingdom." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Ilara felt the first stirring of something that wasn't quite fear. Curiosity, perhaps, or the dangerous beginning of hope. She'd expected to be sold into servitude or worse, but this strange pale lord spoke of kingdoms and salvation. "I don't understand," she said. "I'm nobody, the daughter of grain farmers who couldn't afford to feed their children. What could I possibly do to save anything?" Kieran leaned forward slightly, and in the moonlight streaming through the carriage window, his skin seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. "You possess something that no amount of gold or silver could purchase, something that makes you worth more than kingdoms." "What?" "Your blood, Ilara Whitmore, carries the mark of the ancient bloodline. You are descended from the witch queens who once ruled these lands, and your veins run with magic that has slept for 3 generations. Ilara's hand flew instinctively to her throat. "That's impossible. My grandmother might have known herb lore, but there's no magic in our family. We're common folk." "Common folk don't have eyes that change color with their emotions," Piran observed quietly. "Common folk don't make flowers bloom in winter or calm frightened animals with a touch." She opened her mouth to deny it, then stopped. All her life, she'd explained away the small impossibilities, the way injured birds recovered after she held them, the way her mother's garden flourished even in drought years, the way she sometimes knew things before they happened. "Even if what you say is true," she said slowly, "what does it matter? Magic doesn't fill empty bellies or keep roof from leaking." "No," Kieran agreed, "but it can save the lives of thousands. My people are dying, Ilara. A plague sweeps through the vampire clans, turning us to dust before our time. Traditional remedies have failed, and our healers are at a loss. Only the blood of a true-born witch can break the curse that binds this sickness to us." "Vampire clans," Ilara repeated the words, as if they were in a foreign language. "You're saying you're a vampire?" "I am the alpha vampire of the Northern Territories," Kieran said matter-of-factly. "I have lived for over 600 years, commanded armies of the undead, and held dominion over lands that stretch from the sea to the mountains. And I am dying." To prove his point, he pulled back the sleeve of his black coat. Even in the dim light, Ilara could see the veins beneath his pale skin were dark, almost black, spreading up his arm like ink through water. "How long do you have?" she asked, surprised by the compassion in her own voice. "Without your help? Perhaps a month. The plague moves faster in those of us with greater power." He rolled his sleeve back down. "With your help, my people and I might see another century." "And if I refuse?" Kieran's expression grew grave. "Then you are free to return to your family, and we will all face whatever fate awaits us. I will not force you to save us, Ilara Whitmore. That choice must be yours alone." The carriage slowed, and through the window, Ilara could see the silhouette of a massive castle rising against the star-filled sky. Towers and spires reached toward the heavens like grasping fingers, and lights flickered in countless windows. It was beautiful and terrible, and utterly unlike anything she'd ever imagined. "Why didn't you simply take my blood by force?" she asked. "Surely that would have been easier than making deals with desperate farmers." "Because magic freely given is 100 times more powerful than magic taken by force," Kieran explained. "And because I needed you to understand what was at stake before asking you to choose." The carriage came to a stop in a courtyard illuminated by torches that burned with blue flames. Kieran stepped out first,
then offered his hand to help her down. His touch was cold but somehow comforting, and she felt a strange tingling sensation where their skin met. "Welcome to Ravenge Hollow Castle," he said, his voice echoing off the stone walls around them. "Your kingdom awaits." As they approached the massive wooden doors, Elara caught sight of figures moving in the shadows. Pale, elegant beings who watched their arrival with expressions of desperate hope. These were his people, she realized, the vampires who were counting on her to save them from extinction. The doors swung open without anyone touching them, revealing a grand hall that took her breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on marble floors. Tapestries depicting ancient battles adorned the walls, and a fire large enough to roast an entire ox crackled in the hearth at the far end of the room. But it was the assembled crowd that truly captured her attention. Dozens of vampires filled the hall, all of them bearing the same dark veins that she'd seen on Kieran's arm. Men and women who should have been in the prime of their eternal lives looked wan and fragile, some leaning on others for support. "My lord," a woman with silver hair approached them, her voice weak but filled with relief. "You've returned, and this is—" "Lady Cordelia, may I present Miss Elara Whitmore," Kieran said formally. "Elara, this is my second-in-command and the keeper of castle affairs." Cordelia's eyes widened as she looked at Elara, and she sank into a deep curtsy. "My lady, we are in your debt." "I haven't agreed to anything yet," Elara said quickly, uncomfortable with the reverence in the vampire's voice. "Of course," Cordelia straightened, "but you're here, and that alone gives us hope." Kieran gestured toward a grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. "Come, I'll show you to your chambers. You'll want to rest before we discuss the ritual tomorrow." "Ritual?" Elara followed him up the stairs, her hand trailing along the smooth marble banister. "You didn't mention a ritual." "The process of transferring magical healing through blood is complex," Kieran explained as they walked down a long corridor lined with portraits of stern-looking vampires from ages past. "It requires preparation, proper ceremony, and willing participation from both parties." He stopped at a door carved with intricate rose designs and pushed it open. The room beyond was larger than her family's entire cottage, with a four-poster bed draped in emerald silk, a fireplace surrounded by comfortable chairs, and tall windows that offered a view of moonlit gardens. "This is your room," Kieran said. "Ring the bell if you need anything. Food will be brought up shortly." "Wait." Elara caught his arm as he turned to leave. His skin was cold as marble beneath her touch, but she felt that strange tingling sensation again. "This ritual, will it hurt you?" Something flickered in his ancient eyes, an expression she couldn't quite read. "The pain is irrelevant. What matters is survival." "That's not what I asked." Kieran studied her face for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally, "it will likely be excruciating. The magical healing process burns away the plague, but it also burns the one being healed. I may not survive it." "And you're willing to die for your people?" "I am willing to try to live for them," he corrected. "There's a difference." After he left, Elara sank onto the enormous bed and stared out at the alien landscape beyond her windows. Somehow, in the span of a few hours, she'd gone from being the daughter of desperate farmers to the potential savior of a vampire kingdom. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. A young vampire entered, carrying a silver tray laden with foods Elara had only heard described in stories. Roasted pheasant, fresh bread with real butter, fruits out of season, and delicate pastries that looked like works of art. "My name is Marcus," the vampire said, setting the tray on a small table near the fireplace. I serve as Lord Kieran's personal attendant. Is there anything else you require? Information, Ilara said, moving to the table and inhaling the incredible aromas. How long has this plague been affecting your people? Marcus hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty was warranted. 6 months, my lady. It began in the outer territories and spread inward. We've lost nearly a third of our population. And you've tried everything else? Every remedy in our considerable archives. Traditional vampire healing, ancient blood rituals, medicines acquired from human doctors, even desperate attempts at magical intervention from the few witches we could find. He shook his head. Nothing has worked. The plague seems to be specifically designed to target our kind. Designed? Ilara looked up from the feast before her. You think someone created this plague intentionally? That is Lord Kieran's suspicion, though he hasn't shared his theories with most of us. Marcus moved to light the candles scattered around the room. All we know is that it appeared suddenly, spreads rapidly, and seems to be resistant to every form of treatment we've attempted. After Marcus left, Ilara tried to eat, but her appetite had vanished. If someone had deliberately created a plague to destroy the vampire clans, then helping them recover might put her own life in danger. And yet, looking out at the lights scattered throughout the castle, each one representing a life hanging in the balance, she found it difficult to consider walking away. She was still wrestling with her decision when another knock came at her door. This time, it was Kieran himself, looking more human in simple dark clothing than he had in his formal coat. "May I come in?" he asked. "I thought you might have questions." "Several hundred," Ilara admitted, stepping aside to let him enter. "But I'll start with the most important one. If this ritual works, what happens to me afterward?" Kieran moved to stand by the windows, his pale hands clasped behind his back. "You would be free to leave, return to your family, live whatever life you choose. The contract your father signed binds you only to attempt the healing ritual, not to remain in service afterward. And if it doesn't work, then you would still be free to leave, and I would arrange for your family to receive additional support to see them through the difficult times ahead." Ilara studied his profile in the moonlight. "You're not telling me everything." He turned toward her, and she was struck again by how ancient his eyes looked despite his youthful appearance. "What do you want to know? If this plague was created intentionally, who did it, and why?" Kieran was silent for so long that Ilara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "There are those among the human population who believe that vampires are an abomination that should be destroyed. Over the years, we've tried to coexist peacefully, taking only what we needed to survive, protecting human settlements from other supernatural threats. But fear and hatred run deep. You think humans created this plague? I think a group of human extremists found a way to weaponize magic against us," Kieran said. "And I think they won't stop until every vampire in existence has been reduced to dust." The implications sent a chill down Ilara's spine. If they're willing to create magical plagues, what's to stop them from targeting anyone else who gets in their way? "Nothing," Kieran said simply, "which is why your decision affects more than just the vampires of this castle. If they succeed in destroying us, they'll turn their attention to other supernatural beings, the werewolf packs, the remaining witch covens, the Fae courts, anyone who doesn't fit their vision of a purely human world." Ilara sank into one of the chairs by the fireplace, her mind reeling. "You're saying this is about more than just saving your people?" "I'm saying this is about preventing a war that could tear apart the balance that has existed for millennia." Kieran moved to sit across from her, his expression grave. "But I won't lie to you about the risks. If these extremists discover that you've helped us, they may target you and your family as well. They would hurt innocent people? They've already hurt innocent people. Every vampire who has died from this plague had family, friends, loved ones. Many of them never harmed a human being in their entire existence. Elara thought of the desperate hope she'd seen in the eyes of the vampires gathered in the Great Hall, of Marcus's quiet dignity, of Cordelia's obvious devotion to her lord. These weren't the monsters of childhood nightmares. They were people facing extinction. "Tell me about the ritual," she said quietly. Kieran leaned forward, his hands pressed together. "It requires a blood exchange, but not in the way you might think. Your blood, infused with your ancestral magic, must be combined with a potion brewed from rare herbs and minerals. I would drink the mixture while you maintain physical contact, channeling your magic through the connection to burn away the plague. How long does it take?" "Several hours, and it must be done during the full moon, when magical energies are at their peak." Elara glanced toward the window, where the moon hung nearly complete in the star-filled sky. "Which is tomorrow night?" "Yes. And if something goes wrong?" Kieran's jaw tightened. "The magical backlash could kill us both. Or the plague could prove too strong, and I could die anyway, taking your magic with me and leaving you drained of the power that makes you special." "You're not exactly selling this," Elara said with a shaky laugh. "I'm trying to be honest about what I'm asking of you." Kieran stood and moved to the door. "Think about it tonight. Give me your answer in the morning." After he left, Elara extinguished the candles and climbed into the enormous bed, but sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her brother's face pressed against the window, her mother's tears, her father's shame. They had sold her to save themselves, and now she was being asked to risk everything to save strangers. But were they really strangers? In the few hours she'd been at Raven's Hollow Castle, she'd been treated with more kindness and respect than she'd known in her entire life. Kieran could have simply taken what he needed from her, but instead he offered her choice, freedom, and honest answers to difficult questions. As the hours passed and dawn approached, Elara found herself thinking less about the risks and more about the lives hanging in the balance. Hundreds of vampires faced certain death if she refused to help. Her family would survive either way. Kieran had made that clear. But could she live with herself, knowing she'd chosen safety over salvation, when the choice had been hers to make? When the sun finally rose, painting her chamber in shades of gold and rose, Elara had made her decision. She dressed in the simple gown that had been provided, brushed her hair with her mother's wooden comb, and made her way downstairs to the Great Hall. Kieran was waiting for her, standing before the massive fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back. He looked as if he hadn't slept either. "Have you decided?" he asked without preamble. "I have."
Elara lifted her chin, channeling every bit of courage her 17 years had given her. "I'll do the ritual." Relief flooded Kieran's expression, followed quickly by something that might have been admiration. "Are you certain?" "No," Elara admitted. "I'm terrified, but I'm certain that I can't live with myself if I don't at least try." "Then we begin preparations immediately," Kieran said. "The full moon rises at sunset." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Cordelia took charge of Elara's preparation, explaining the ritual in greater detail and helping her understand how to channel and direct her magical energy. The process was exhausting. Elara had never consciously used magic before, and learning to control something she'd never acknowledged was like trying to steer a ship in a storm. "Feel the power flowing through you," Cordelia instructed as they worked in a chamber filled with ancient books and magical artifacts. "Don't try to force it or hold it back. Let it move naturally and guide it where it needs to go." Elara closed her eyes and reached deep within herself, searching for the source of the strange sensations she'd always dismissed. Gradually, she became aware of a warm, golden energy that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat.
When she opened her eyes, her hands were glowing with soft light. "Excellent," Cordelia said, though she looked tired from the effort of teaching. "You have remarkable natural ability. With proper training, you could become quite powerful. Will I still have these abilities after the ritual?" "That depends on how much of your magic is required to break the plague," Cordelia said honestly. "You might retain some power, or you might find yourself completely ordinary afterward. There's no way to know until it's done." As evening approached, Ilara found herself growing more nervous. She'd had no appetite for the elaborate meal that had been prepared, and her hands shook as she tried to braid her hair. A soft knock at her door interrupted her struggles. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Marcus or Cordelia. Instead, Kieran entered, carrying a small wooden box. "I have something for you," he said, setting the box on her table and opening it to reveal a pendant on a silver chain. The stone at its center was deep blue, shot through with veins of silver, and it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "It's beautiful," Ilara breathed, reaching out to touch the pendant. The stone was warm beneath her fingers, and she felt a surge of calm energy flow through her. "It belonged to the last witch queen of these lands," Kieran said, lifting the chain and settling it around Ilara's neck. "She was my ally and my friend, and she died protecting both our peoples from those who would destroy us. I think she would want you to have it." The weight of the pendant against her chest was comforting, and Ilara felt some of her nervousness fade. "Thank you." "Are you ready?" Kieran asked, studying her face in the candlelight. "As ready as I'll ever be." They made their way to the castle's highest tower, where a circular chamber had been prepared for the ritual. Candles burned at the cardinal points, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. In the center of the room, a table held an ornate chalice, various herbs and powders, and a silver knife with an elaborately carved handle. "The moon is rising," Cordelia observed from her position near the eastern window. Around the chamber's perimeter, other vampires waited in respectful silence, witnesses to what might be their salvation or their lord's final moments. Kieran moved to the table and began combining ingredients in the chalice, his movements precise and practiced. "When the moon reaches its zenith," he said, without looking up, "we begin." Ilara watched him work, noting the way his dark veins seemed to pulse more rapidly as the moon climbed higher in the sky. The plague was advancing, she realized. "Now," Cordelia announced. Kieran picked up the silver knife and made a small cut across his palm, letting several drops of dark blood fall into the chalice. Then he offered the knife to Ilara. She took it with steady hands, surprised by her own calm. The blade was sharp, and she barely felt the sting as it opened a thin line across her palm. Her blood, bright red in contrast to Kieran's, dripped into the mixture. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. The contents of the chalice began to glow, shifting from red to gold to silver, casting rainbow patterns on the ceiling above them. The pendant around Ilara's neck grew warm, then hot, and she felt her magic responding to its call. Kieran lifted the chalice to his lips and drank deeply. The effect was almost instantaneous. He doubled over in pain, his face contorting as if he were being burned from within. The dark veins in his arms began to writhe like living things, and he cried out in agony. "Now, Ilara," Cordelia shouted over the sound of Kieran's anguish. "Give him your magic." Ilara reached out and grasped Kieran's free hand, feeling the connection snap into place like a bridge of light between them. The pendant around her neck blazed like a small sun, and she felt her magic pouring out of her in golden torrents, flowing into Kieran's suffering form. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It felt as though every nerve in her body had caught fire, as though her very soul was being stretched and reshaped. She could feel the plague inside Kieran, a writhing mass of darkness that fought against her light, and she poured more power into the battle. Through their connection, she experienced flashes of Kieran's memories, 6 centuries of life, love, loss, and leadership. She saw him as a young man, newly turned and struggling to understand his nature. She witnessed him building alliances between supernatural communities, protecting human settlements from rogue vampires, fighting wars to preserve the balance between worlds. She also felt his loneliness, the weight of command that isolated him from those he led, and his growing certainty that he would die without ever finding someone who could understand the burden he carried. The plague fought back viciously, sending waves of corrupted energy through their connection. Ilara felt it trying to invade her own system, seeking to destroy the source of the healing power. But the pendant at her throat blazed brighter, and she heard a voice in her mind, ancient, feminine, and filled with strength. "Fight, child. Fight for both your peoples. You are stronger than you know." Drawing on reserves of power she hadn't known she possessed, Ilara pushed back against the plague with everything she had. The golden light of her magic became a sword, cutting through the darkness that threatened to consume them both. She felt the moment when the plague's hold began to weaken, its grip on Kieran's life force starting to loosen. But the effort was draining her rapidly. She could feel her strength ebbing, her magical reserves running low. If she couldn't break the plague soon, they would both be consumed by the backlash. "I can't hold it," she gasped, her knees buckling. Kieran's eyes snapped open, blazing with silver light. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice somehow reaching her despite the magical storm raging around them. "I believe in you." Those words, spoken with absolute conviction, gave Ilara the strength for one final push. She gathered every remaining spark of her magic and hurled it at the core of the plague, feeling the pendant around her neck crack from the strain. The darkness shattered like glass. The chamber fell silent, except for the sound of their labored breathing. Kieran's hand was still clasped in hers, but the dark veins that had marked his arms were gone, replaced by healthy, pale skin. The chalice on the table had cracked down the middle, and the pendant around Ilara's neck had gone dark. "Is it over?" she whispered. Kieran sat up slowly, examining his arms in wonder. "It's over. The plague is gone." A cheer went up from the vampires around the chamber's perimeter, and Cordelia rushed forward to examine her lord. "The fever has broken," she announced, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. "You're healing." But Ilara barely heard the celebration. The effort of channeling so much magic had left her completely drained, and she collapsed onto the stone floor, unconscious before she hit the ground. She woke 3 days later in her chamber, weak but alive. Kieran was sitting in a chair beside her bed, looking healthier than she'd ever seen him. The gaunt, desperate expression was gone, replaced by something that might have been peace. "How do you feel?" he asked when he saw her eyes open. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of horses," Ilara admitted, struggling to sit up. "But alive. Did it work for everyone?" "It worked," Kieran confirmed. "The healing spread through our blood connections to every vampire in the kingdom. We're all free of the plague. And my family? Safe and prosperous. I sent a cartload of supplies and enough gold to see them through the next several years. Your brother has started attending the village school, and your parents are planning to expand their farm." Relief washed over Ilara, though it was tinged with sadness. She'd saved Kieran's people and secured her family's future, but she wasn't sure where that left her. "What happens now?" she asked. Kieran leaned forward, his expression serious. "Now you have choices to make. I can arrange for you to return to your family,
Or you could remain here as an honored guest. There's also a third option, which is you could stay as my partner. Help me rebuild the relationships between our peoples, work to prevent future conflicts, use whatever magic you have left to heal the wounds that have been opened between humans and vampires. Ilara studied his face, looking for any sign that this offer was born of gratitude rather than genuine feeling. What she saw in his ancient eyes was something she'd never expected to find: love, fragile and new, but real. "You barely know me," she said softly. "I know that you risked your life to save strangers. I know that you have more courage in your little finger than most people possess in their entire bodies. And I know that in 3 days of watching you sleep, I've felt more peace than I've experienced in 6 centuries." "The ritual created a connection between us," Ilara said, remembering the flood of memories and emotions she'd experienced. "How do I know these feelings are real and not just magical after-effects?" Kieran smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked truly young. "You don't, neither do I, but I'd like the chance to find out." Ilara thought of her family's cottage, of the simple life she'd always known, of the safety and predictability she could return to. Then she thought of the larger world she'd glimpsed, of the supernatural communities that needed protection, of the work that could be done to prevent future wars. She also thought of the man sitting beside her bed, who had trusted her with his life and his people's future, who had offered her honesty when lies would have been easier, who had given her choices when he could have simply commanded. "I'll need time to decide," she said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need." Over the following weeks, as Ilara recovered her strength, she explored Ravenshollow Castle and got to know its inhabitants. She discovered that vampires were far more complex and varied than the story suggested. Some were scholars, others artists. Many were devoted to protecting the balance between the supernatural and human worlds. She also spent time with Kieran, learning about his history and his hopes for the future. They took long walks through the castle gardens, discussing everything from politics to philosophy to the small details of daily life. Gradually, she began to understand that the connection she felt to him went deeper than magic. It was based on shared values, mutual respect, and a growing affection that seemed to strengthen with each passing day. 3 weeks after the ritual, a messenger arrived with disturbing news. The human extremists who had created the plague were not finished with their war against the supernatural world. They had begun targeting werewolf settlements, and there were rumors of attacks being planned against the remaining witch covens. "They're testing their next weapon," Kieran explained as he shared the intelligence reports with Ilara and his council. "Something designed to be effective against shapeshifters." "Can we stop them?" Ilara asked. "Not alone," Kieran admitted. "But if we could unite the supernatural communities, form an alliance strong enough to defend against these attacks." "You'd need someone they could all trust," Cordelia observed. "Someone who represents the bridge between human and supernatural worlds." All eyes turned to Ilara, and she felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders once again. Her magic had returned somewhat, not as strong as before, but sufficient for healing work and defensive purposes. More importantly, her unique position as a human who had saved the vampire kingdom gave her credibility with all the supernatural communities. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said. "Help me build an alliance," Kieran said. "Travel with me to the werewolf territories, the witch covens, the Fae courts. Convince them that cooperation is the only way to survive what's coming." Ilara looked around the council chamber at the faces of the vampires who had become her friends and allies. Then she met Kieran's gaze, seeing in his ancient eyes the hope and determination that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "When do we leave?" she asked. The smile that spread across Kieran's face was radiant. "As soon as you're ready."
That night, as they stood together on the castle's highest balcony looking out over the moonlit landscape, Kieran took her hand in his. His skin was still cool, but it no longer felt foreign to her touch. "Are you certain about this path?" he asked. "It will be dangerous work, and there's no guarantee we'll succeed." "I'm certain," Alara said, squeezing his fingers. "My parents sold me for a bag of grain, thinking they were trading away their daughter's future. Instead, they gave me the chance to find my true purpose." "Which is?" "Standing between the darkness and the light, making sure neither side destroys the other." She turned to face him fully. "And standing beside someone who understands that burden." Kieran lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we face the future together." As if in response to his words, the pendant around Alara's neck, which she thought was permanently darkened, flickered with a soft, steady glow. The magic wasn't gone after all. It was simply transformed, strengthened by love and purpose into something that could last a lifetime. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs, and Alara could swear she heard the whisper of wind through ancient forests, calling them toward their next adventure. The first alliance meeting took place in neutral territory, a sacred grove that had belonged to no single supernatural community for over 1,000 years. Alara felt her nerves flutter as their carriage approached the gathering place, but Kieran's steady presence beside her provided comfort. "Remember," he said quietly as they prepared to step out, "you are not here as a supplicant. You are here as an equal, representing the bridge between worlds." The grove was magnificent, with trees so ancient their trunks could have housed entire families. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, creating patterns of silver and shadow on the forest floor. Representatives from various supernatural communities had already arrived, werewolves in human form but radiating barely contained wildness, witches whose power crackled in the air around them like static electricity, and fey nobles whose beauty was so perfect it seemed almost artificial. Lord Kieran, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, stepped forward. "I am Alpha Moira of the Northern Pack. We received your message about the attacks." "Alpha Moira." Kieran inclined his head respectfully. "Thank you for coming. May I present Alara Whitmore, the witch-blooded healer who broke the plague that threatened my people." Alara felt the weight of dozens of supernatural gazes as she was introduced to the assembled leaders. Each group had suffered losses from the extremist attacks, and the tension in the grove was palpable. These were beings who had spent centuries maintaining careful distances from each other, and now they were being asked to trust former enemies with their survival. "You're young to be making such grand proposals," observed a witch with intricate tattoos covering her arms. "Because separation is what's killing us," Alara replied, stepping forward despite her nervousness. "These extremists are counting on us remaining divided, handling each attack as an isolated incident. But this isn't random violence. It's a systematic campaign to eliminate supernatural beings entirely." She gestured to the assembled groups. "Your pack lost 12 members to a poisoned water supply last month," she said to Alpha Moira, then turned to the tattooed witch. "Your coven's sacred grove was burned by humans wielding spelled fire that couldn't be extinguished by normal means. And I'm told the Fey courts have discovered iron weapons that somehow bypass your natural immunities." Murmurs rippled through the gathering as the various representatives realized the scope of the coordinated attacks. "These aren't the desperate actions of fearful villagers," Kieran added. "Someone with extensive knowledge of supernatural weaknesses is providing weapons and strategies to human extremists. Someone who understands exactly how to hurt each of our communities most effectively." A Fey Lord with wings like stained glass stepped forward, his voice carrying the musical quality of his people. "You speak of a traitor among the supernatural communities?"
Or a human with access to very old, very dangerous knowledge, Elara said. Either way, they're using our isolation against us. While we remain separate, they can pick us off one community at a time. And what exactly are you proposing? Alpha Moira asked, her yellow eyes fixed intently on Elara's face. A formal alliance, Kieran replied. Shared intelligence, coordinated defenses, and mutual aid when any community comes under attack. The vampires have resources, wealth, influence in human society, and centuries of accumulated knowledge, Elara added. The werewolves have strength, speed, and pack loyalty that could serve as the backbone of our defense forces. The witches possess magical abilities that could counter whatever spelled weapons our enemies are using. And the Fae have connections to the oldest magic in this world, power that predates human civilization. You make it sound simple, the tattooed witch said skeptically.
But what happens when our interests conflict? What happens when the Alliance asks one community to sacrifice for another? Then we find another way, Elara said firmly. The moment we start viewing each other as acceptable losses, we become no better than the extremists who want us all dead. The discussions continued deep into the night, with representatives voicing concerns, negotiating terms, and gradually working toward consensus. Elara found herself serving as mediator when tensions arose. Her unique position as a human ally allowing her to speak to concerns that the supernatural leaders couldn't address among themselves. As dawn approached, Alpha Moira stood and addressed the gathering. The Northern Pack agrees to join this alliance, with the condition that each community retains autonomy over its internal affairs. One by one, the other representatives voiced their agreement, until only the Faelord remained silent. When all eyes turned to him, he spread his iridescent wings and smiled. "The Fae courts will join your alliance," he said, "but we require one additional term." "Name it," Kieran said. "The Bridge Builder," the Faelord gestured toward Elara, "must be formally recognized as the Alliance's diplomatic representative. She has proven tonight that she can speak for all our interests, and the success of this venture will depend on having someone who can navigate between communities without being beholden to any single one." Elara felt her heart skip a beat. "I don't have any diplomatic training." "You have something far more valuable," the Faelord interrupted. "You have the trust of people who don't trust easily, and the courage to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable to hear." The formal alliance treaty was signed 3 days later at Ravenshallow Castle, with representatives from all the major supernatural communities in attendance. Elara found herself signing as the Alliance diplomatic representative, a title that still felt surreal. "Are you having second thoughts?" Kieran asked as they watched the various delegations prepare to depart. "About the Alliance? No. About my ability to do this job justice? Absolutely." Elara touched the pendant at her throat, which had grown brighter over the past few days. "What if I make a mistake that gets people killed? Then you'll learn from it and do better next time," Kieran said pragmatically. "That's what leadership is. Making the best decisions you can with the information you have and accepting responsibility for the consequences." Their first real test came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after the alliance was formed, a werewolf settlement in the Eastern Territories was attacked by a group of humans wielding weapons that seemed to nullify shape-shifting abilities. The pack was trapped in human form, vulnerable and terrified. The witch's scrying magic shows at least 50 attackers surrounding the settlement, Cordelia reported during an emergency meeting. They're armed with spelled crossbows and some kind of alchemical compound that prevents transformation. "How long before our people can reach them?" Kieran asked. "Vampire reinforcements could be there by tomorrow night," one of his lieutenants replied. "But by then, the settlement could be destroyed," Elara finished grimly. She studied the map spread across the council table, noting the distance between their current location and the besieged werewolves. What about a joint rescue operation? Explain. Vampire speed to get there quickly, witch magic to counter whatever's preventing the shape-shifting, and fey glamour to confuse the attackers. Ilara traced potential routes on the map. We could have a mixed team there within hours instead of days. It was a risky plan that required coordination between communities that had never worked together in combat. But it was also the kind of rapid response that could save lives and prove the alliance's value. 6 hours later, Ilara found herself crouched in the forest outside the besieged werewolf settlement, her heart hammering as she watched the rescue operation unfold. Vampire scouts had provided intelligence on the attackers' positions. Witchcrafted counterspells had restored the werewolves' ability to transform, and fey illusions had sown confusion among the human extremists. Now, Kieran whispered into the communication crystal that linked the various schemes. The attack was swift and decisive. Werewolves burst from their trapped settlement in full wolf form, while vampires struck from the shadows and witches rained magical havoc down on the human weapons. The extremists, caught completely off guard by the coordinated supernatural response, broke and fled within minutes. Casualties? Ilara asked as the teams regrouped. 3 wounded werewolves, all stable, Alpha Moira reported. No deaths on our side. And the extremists? Scattered to the winds, Kieran said with satisfaction, though we did manage to capture several of their spelled weapons for study. The success of the rescue operation sent ripples throughout both the supernatural and human communities. Word spread that the various supernatural groups were no longer isolated targets, and several planned attacks were abandoned as the extremists realized they could no longer count on facing divided opposition. But the victory also brought new challenges. Some human communities, frightened by the display of coordinated supernatural power, began viewing the alliance as a threat rather than a defensive measure. Fear-mongering spread through villages and towns, painting the supernatural alliance as the first step toward domination of the human world. We need to address these concerns before they escalate, Ilara said during a strategy meeting a month after the rescue operation. Fear makes people do desperate things, and desperate people are exactly what the extremists are hoping to recruit.
"What do you suggest?" asked Thorn, the witch representative who had become a regular advisor to the Alliance leadership. Public outreach. Demonstrate that the Alliance exists to protect, not conquer. Ilara stood and moved to the large map that dominated one wall of the conference room. There are human settlements throughout the region that face threats the Alliance could help with: natural disasters, bandit attacks, disease outbreaks. If we can show that our power is being used to help rather than harm, we risk exposing our people to attack, Alpha Moira pointed out. Sending supernatural beings into human settlements could be seen as provocation. Or it could be seen as proof that we're not the monsters they've been told we are, Ilara countered. Fear thrives in ignorance. The more ordinary humans interact with supernatural beings in positive contexts, the harder it becomes for extremists to demonize us. The outreach program started small, with carefully selected missions that posed minimal risk to the supernatural volunteers. A vampire healer helped fight a plague outbreak in a remote mountain village. A pack of werewolves assisted with rescue operations after a flash flood. Witches provided protection charms for farming communities plagued by unusually severe storms. Each success built trust and credibility, creating networks of human allies who could counter the extremists' propaganda with first-hand accounts of supernatural assistance. But the program also revealed the true scope of the opposition they faced. The extremists have cells in major cities throughout the region. Kieran reported after returning from a reconnaissance mission. They're not just rural fanatics. They have support from wealthy merchants, influential nobles, even some religious leaders. They're also better organized than we initially thought, Thorne added, spreading intelligence reports across the table. Coordinated supply lines, standardized weapons, unified command structure. This isn't a grassroots movement. It's a military campaign. Ilara studied the reports, noting patterns in the extremists' activities. They're building towards something big. All these smaller attacks, the weapons testing, the recruitment drives, it's preparation for a major offensive. Against which target? Alpha Moira asked. All of us, Ilara said grimly. I think they're planning a simultaneous attack on every major supernatural stronghold in the region. Hit us all at once before we can coordinate a response. The intelligence proved accurate. 3 weeks later, Alliance scouts reported massive human forces mobilizing in secret camps throughout the territory. The extremists had spent months preparing for what they clearly intended to be a final solution to the supernatural problem. Numbers? Kieran asked during the Emergency War Council. At least 3,000 armed humans, divided into specialized units targeting specific supernatural weaknesses, reported Lyra, the Fae intelligence officer. They have weapons designed to kill vampires, nets spelled to trap shapeshifters, iron weapons to harm Fae, and some kind of magical dampening field that could neutralize witch powers. When do they plan to attack? The new moon, Lyra said, when supernatural powers are at their weakest. That gave them 6 days to prepare for what would essentially be a war for survival. But instead of despair, Ilara felt a strange sense of clarity settling over her. This was what all their preparation had been leading toward, the moment when the Alliance would either prove its worth or fall to pieces under pressure. We're not going to wait for them to attack, she announced, surprising even herself with the steel in her voice. We're going to strike first. Explain, Kieran said, though there was approval in his ancient eyes. They're counting on us being reactive, defensive. They expect us to fortify our strongholds and wait for the siege. Ilara moved to the tactical map, pointing to the locations of the extremist camps. But we have advantages they don't expect. Vampire speed, werewolf senses, witch magic, and Fae glamour. If we coordinate properly, we can hit all their camps simultaneously before they're ready to launch their own attack. That's incredibly risky, Alpha Moira pointed out. If we fail, we'll have revealed our full capabilities and lost the element of surprise. If we don't try, we'll be fighting a defensive war against superior numbers while they control the timing and location of every engagement, Ilara countered. This way, we choose the battleground. The debate continued for hours, with representatives voicing concerns and proposing modifications to the plan. But gradually, consensus emerged around the basic strategy, a coordinated preemptive strike designed to shatter the extremist forces before they could launch their own offensive. There's one more thing, Ilara said as the planning session wound down. I want to try reaching out to the moderate human leadership one more time. If we can convince them to publicly condemn the extremists, you're asking humans to choose sides in a conflict between their own species and supernatural beings, Kieran said gently. That's asking a great deal. Yes, it is, Ilara agreed. But there are humans who understand that coexistence is possible, who've benefited from the Alliance's protection. If they speak out now, it could prevent this conflict from escalating into a broader war between species. The outreach efforts yielded mixed results. Some human leaders issued statements supporting peaceful coexistence, while others remained silent or actively endorsed the extremist position. But the public discourse had shifted enough that the extremists could no longer claim universal human support for their cause.
On the night before the planned operation, Ilara stood once again on Raven's Hollow's castle's highest balcony, looking out over the assembled Alliance forces. Vampires, werewolves, witches, and fae had put aside centuries of mistrust to stand together against a common threat. It was beautiful and terrible and utterly unprecedented. "Second thoughts?" Kieran asked, joining her at the stone railing. "About the mission? No. About everything that led us to this point." Ilara considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen differently. If I'd refused the ritual, gone back to my family, lived a simple life. You would have been safe," Kieran said, "but thousands of others would have died. And you? Would you have found another way to break the plague?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but I know that I would have faced whatever came next alone, and that would have been a much darker fate than death." Ilara turned to face him fully, studying the face that had become so dear to her over the past months. "No regrets? Only one," Kieran said, reaching up to cup her cheek in his cool palm. "That it took a crisis to bring us together. I wish we could have met under better circumstances." "These are the circumstances we have," Ilara said, leaning into his touch, "and I can't imagine facing them with anyone else." Their kiss was gentle, but filled with the weight of everything they might lose in the coming battle. When they finally broke apart, the pendant around Ilara's neck was glowing with steady, warm light. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Kieran said, "know that you've already changed the world. The Alliance exists because of your courage, and that will outlast any single battle. We'll win," Ilara said with quiet confidence, "because we have something they don't, which is each other." The attack began at dawn, with Alliance forces striking 8 extremist camps simultaneously across the region. Ilara accompanied the team targeting the largest camp, where intelligence suggested the extremist leadership was coordinating their planned offensive. The battle was fierce but brief. Caught completely off guard by the coordinated assault, the extremist forces found themselves fighting an enemy unlike anything they'd prepared for. Vampire speed allowed for lightning strikes against key targets. Werewolf pack tactics disrupted their formations. Witch magic countered their spelled weapons, and Fey glamour sowed confusion throughout their ranks. "Surrender!" Ilara called out as the camp's defensive perimeter collapsed. "You're surrounded and outnumbered." To her surprise, many of the extremists threw down their weapons rather than continue a hopeless battle. These weren't fanatical zealots willing to die for their cause. They were ordinary people who had been convinced that supernatural beings posed an existential threat to humanity. "You're making a mistake," one of the captured extremist leaders spat as he was brought before the Alliance commanders. "Humans will never accept supernatural domination. This is just the beginning." "We're not seeking domination," Ilara replied calmly. "We're seeking coexistence. But we will defend ourselves against those who try to destroy us." The aftermath of the battle brought both victory and new challenges. The extremist forces had been shattered, their leaders captured or scattered, and their supply lines disrupted. But the conflict had also revealed the depth of fear and mistrust that existed between human and supernatural communities. "What happens now?" Alpha Moira asked during the post-battle assessment. "We've won this fight, but the underlying tensions remain." "Now we do the hard work of building lasting peace," Ilara said. "We use this victory as an opportunity to demonstrate that coexistence is not only possible, but beneficial for everyone." The peace negotiations that followed were complex and often frustrating, involving not just the captured extremist leaders, but representatives from major human governments and institutions. Ilara found herself serving as the primary mediator, translating between groups that spoke different languages of power and priority. You ask humans to trust beings who possess powers we can't match or counter, said Duke Aldrich, the chief human negotiator. What assurances can you offer that supernatural communities won't use those powers to dominate or exploit human populations? The same assurances you can offer that humans won't use their weapons to hunt supernatural beings to extinction, Ilara replied. None, beyond our word and our demonstrated commitment to peaceful coexistence. That's hardly reassuring. Then let's build something more concrete, Ilara suggested. A formal treaty establishing rights and responsibilities for all communities, with enforcement mechanisms that involve both human and supernatural authority. The treaty negotiations took months, but gradually a framework emerged that addressed the concerns of all parties. Supernatural communities agreed to restrictions on the use of their powers against humans, while human governments committed to protecting supernatural beings from persecution and violence. There's one final matter, Duke Aldrich said as the treaty neared completion, the question of leadership. Who speaks for the supernatural communities in ongoing diplomatic relations? The question had been inevitable, but Ilara still felt unprepared for it. Over the course of the crisis, she had somehow evolved from reluctant participant to de facto leader of the alliance. But formal recognition of that role would change everything. The alliance representatives have discussed this matter, Kieran said, speaking for the assembled supernatural leaders. We propose that Ilara Whitmore be recognized as the Alliance diplomatic representative, with authority to negotiate on behalf of all supernatural communities. A human representing supernatural interests, Duke Aldrich mused. There's a certain poetic justice to that. I'm not human, Ilara said quietly. Not entirely. I'm something new, a bridge between worlds, with loyalties to both and the power to protect each from the other. The final treaty was signed on the first anniversary of the night Ilara had performed the ritual to save Kieran's life. As she added her signature to the document that would reshape relations between human and supernatural communities, she thought of the desperate girl who had been sold for a bag of grain and could hardly believe the journey that had led her to this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked as they walked through the gardens of Ravenshallow Castle later that evening. "My parents," Ilara admitted. "They thought they were trading away my future for their family's survival. They had no idea they were actually setting me on the path to find my true destiny. Have you considered visiting them, showing them what you've become?" Ilara paused beside a fountain where moonlight danced on the water. "I've thought about it, but I'm not sure they would understand. The girl they sold was simple and powerless. The woman I've become might frighten them. Or she might inspire them," Kieran suggested. "You've proven that extraordinary things can come from the most ordinary beginnings." As if summoned by their conversation, a messenger arrived with a letter bearing the seal of Ilara's home village. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax and unfolded the parchment. "It's from Thomas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My younger brother." "He says he's heard stories about the Alliance diplomatic representative, about someone who sounds like his sister, but couldn't possibly be, because she's too important and powerful to be the girl who used to help him catch fireflies." Kieran smiled. "What does he want?" "To know if the stories are true, and if they are, he wants me to know that he's proud of me, and that he never believed Papa had any choice but to let me go." Tears blurred Ilara's vision as she read the rest of the letter. "He says the family has prospered beyond their wildest dreams, and they pray every night for my safety and happiness." "Will you write back?" "Yes," Ilara said without hesitation, "and I think it's time for a visit home. There are things I need to say, and people I want to see." The reunion with her family was both joyful and awkward. Her parents were awed by the elegant woman their daughter had become, uncertain how to relate to someone who wielded political power they could barely comprehend. But Thomas treated her exactly as he always had, as his beloved older sister who happened to have had some interesting adventures.